In the spring of 1942, the German Luftwaffe opened a new prisoner of war camp in the forests of Lower Silesia, about 100 miles southeast of Berlin, near the small town of Sagan. This camp, designated Stalag Luft III, was specifically designed to hold Allied Air Force officers who had been shot down over occupied Europe. The Germans chose this location carefully. The sandy soil beneath the pine forests made tunneling extremely difficult, as the sand would collapse easily and leave telltale yellow traces on the dark camp soil. The camp was built far from any neutral borders, making escape and evasion nearly impossible, even if a prisoner managed to get out. The Commandant, Luftwaffe officer Friedrich Wilhelm von Landener-Waldau, was a World War I veteran who treated his prisoners according to the Geneva Convention, maintaining a degree of professional respect between captors and captives. The prisoners who began arriving at Stalag Luft III were a remarkable collection of men. They came from Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, Norway, and other Allied nations. Many were highly educated, coming from universities and professional backgrounds before the war. They were pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners who had survived being shot down, often after harrowing experiences over enemy territory. These men had been the cream of their respective air forces, trained at great expense, and they shared a common characteristic: an absolute refusal to accept their captivity as the end of their contribution to the war effort. The Geneva Convention stated that it was the duty of a prisoner of war to attempt escape, and these men took that duty seriously. The camp itself was divided into several compounds, each holding hundreds of prisoners and surrounded by double barbed wire fences. Guard towers, or goon boxes as the prisoners called them, stood at regular intervals, manned by guards with machine guns and searchlights. A warning wire ran around the inside perimeter of each compound, about 30 feet from the main fence. Any prisoner who crossed this wire could be shot without warning. Beyond the fences lay dense forest, and beyond that, Nazi Germany stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. The nearest neutral territory was Sweden, accessible only by traveling across the Baltic Sea, or Switzerland, which required crossing the entire breadth of the Reich. Despite these formidable obstacles, escape attempts began almost immediately. The British senior officer in the North Compound, Group Captain Herbert Massey, supported escape efforts as a means of keeping up morale and tying down German resources. Even if most escapees were recaptured, the Germans would have to divert troops, police, and railway security to hunt for them. Troops that might otherwise be fighting on the front lines. Early escape attempts were relatively small-scale. Men tried to walk out disguised as guards, hide in garbage wagons, or cut through the wire at night. Most were quickly recaptured, but each attempt taught valuable lessons. In the spring of 1943, a Royal Air Force squadron leader named Roger Bushell arrived at Stalag Luft III. Bushell was a South African-born barrister who had been practicing law in London before the war. He was an accomplished skier, a brilliant organizer, and a man of fierce determination. Bushell had already escaped twice from other camps and had spent months on the run in Prague, where he had been sheltered by Czech resistance fighters. When he was eventually recaptured after the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, he witnessed the brutal Nazi reprisals against the Czech people. He arrived at Stalag Luft III with a burning hatred of the Nazi regime and an absolute determination to strike back in any way possible. Bushell quickly became the leader of the escape committee, earning the code name Big X. He conceived a plan so audacious that it initially seemed impossible. Rather than attempting to get a handful of men out through a single tunnel, Bushell proposed digging 3 tunnels simultaneously. If one was discovered, they would have 2 backups. The tunnels would be deeper and longer than any previously attempted, running 30 feet below ground to avoid detection by seismograph microphones that the Germans used to detect digging. The tunnels would stretch over 300 feet from the prisoners' huts to beyond the tree line outside the camp. And most ambitious of all, Bushell planned to get 200 men out in a single night. The scale of this operation would require the involvement of hundreds of prisoners, even those who had no intention of escaping themselves. Bushell organized the effort like a military campaign, creating specialized departments that operated with the efficiency of a small corporation. He recruited the best men for each job and gave them the resources and authority they needed to succeed. The entire operation would be conducted in complete secrecy, hidden from the German guards who routinely searched the camp and interrogated prisoners. The 3 tunnels were given simple code names: Tom, Dick, and Harry. Tom would start from a darkened corner of one of the huts, Dick from the washroom of another hut, and Harry from under a stove in a third hut. The entrance to each tunnel was concealed with extraordinary ingenuity. The diggers would remove a section of the concrete floor, dig down through the sandy soil, then replace the concrete slab so perfectly that even during inspections, guards would walk over it without suspecting anything. The actual digging was extraordinarily dangerous work. The sandy soil was prone to collapse, and the diggers worked in cramped, claustrophobic conditions with minimal air. A man would lie on his stomach in a space barely wider than his shoulders, chipping away at the sand face with makeshift tools, never knowing if the tons of earth above him might collapse at any moment. Several near collapses occurred during the digging, and men were pulled unconscious from the tunnels, starved of oxygen. The deeper they dug, the worse the air became, until men could only work for short periods before needing to be hauled back to the surface. To solve the air problem, the prisoners created an ingenious ventilation system. They built air pumps from kit bags, hockey sticks, and other materials, creating bellows that could push fresh air through pipes made from powdered milk tins that had been stolen from Red Cross parcels. The tins were opened at both ends, fitted together, and sealed to create continuous ducts. These air pipes ran the entire length of the tunnels, allowing diggers to work much deeper and longer than would otherwise have been possible. The excavated sand posed another enormous challenge. The yellow subsoil sand was completely different in color from the gray topsoil of the camp compound. If prisoners simply dumped the sand anywhere visible, the Germans would immediately know that tunneling was underway.
The solution was a system of sand dispersal that involved dozens of men. Prisoners sewed long, sausage-shaped bags inside their trousers, filling them with tunnel sand. They would walk casually around the compound and, with a tug on a string, release the sand gradually through their trouser legs while other prisoners shuffled it into the topsoil with their feet. The men doing this became known as penguins because of their distinctive waddling walk. Tons of sand were dispersed this way, scattered so gradually and carefully that the Germans never noticed the changing composition of the soil beneath their feet. As the tunnels pushed forward, they needed to be shored up to prevent collapse. The prisoners stole and repurposed thousands of bedboards from the bunks in their huts, leaving themselves with increasingly uncomfortable sleeping arrangements as more and more boards disappeared into the tunnels. These boards were used to create frames that lined the tunnel walls, floor, and ceiling. The tunnel essentially became an underground railway, complete with a trolley system to move diggers, sand, and materials. The trolleys ran on rails made from stolen materials pulled by ropes, allowing for efficient movement through the narrow passages. Lighting the tunnels was achieved through an illegal electrical system. The prisoners had managed to tap into the camp's power supply, running wires into the tunnels and using light bulbs that had been stolen or made from materials scrounged throughout the camp. This electric light was crucial for the diggers and for the teams working on extending the rails and shoring up the walls behind them. The excavation committee organized every aspect of the operation. A security team, headed by a former policeman, coordinated a network of lookouts called stooges, who watched for German guards, or ferrets as the prisoners called them. These ferrets were specially trained guards whose job was to uncover escape attempts. They would appear unexpectedly, searching huts and probing suspicious areas. Whenever a ferret entered the compound, the stooge nearest him would signal to others, and the warning would spread throughout the camp. Men working on the tunnels would immediately stop, hide their tools, and assume innocent activities. The stooge system became so sophisticated that the escape committee knew where every ferret was at every moment of the day. Another department focused on creating the documents and equipment the escapers would need. This was the forgery section, and it was extraordinarily sophisticated. The forgers obtained German documents through bribery, theft, and photography, then created perfect replicas. They made passes, identification papers, travel permits, and letters of authorization. Some of these documents required official stamps, which the forgers carved from the rubber heels of boots or linoleum flooring. The inks were created from crushing up vitamin pills, mixing charcoal with water, or using chemicals extracted from other materials. The quality of these forgeries was so high that they could withstand scrutiny by German officials.
A tailoring section transformed Royal Air Force uniforms and other materials into civilian clothing. Using needles and thread stolen or obtained through bribes, these men created business suits, workmen's clothes, and even German uniforms. The dyes came from the same creative sources as the inks, crushed vitamins, boot polish, and other improvised materials. The civilian clothes had to look authentic enough to pass casual inspection on trains or in stations, complete with appropriate buttons, which were carved from wood or bone. The map-making section created detailed maps of the surrounding area, the railway system, and routes to neutral countries. These maps were copied from atlases in the camp library, from photographs, and from information obtained from newly arrived prisoners who had flown over the terrain. The maps were drawn with extraordinary precision on tissue paper or any other thin material that could be easily hidden. Compasses were manufactured in the camp using smuggled magnetized needles or razor blades that had been carefully magnetized by stroking them against magnets. These were mounted on pivots inside cases made from melted phonograph records or other materials. The compasses were small enough to hide, but accurate enough to guide men across hundreds of miles of enemy territory. Food for the journey was accumulated over months. The prisoners saved portions of their Red Cross parcels, hoarding chocolate, condensed milk, and other high-energy foods. They created concentrated ration packages that each escaper would carry, designed to last for several days of travel. Some prisoners even saved their cigarette rations to use as bribes or currency during their escape. All of this activity took place under the constant threat of discovery. The Germans conducted regular searches, often tearing apart huts looking for tunnels or contraband. The prisoners developed elaborate concealment systems, hiding documents in false-bottomed containers, tools in hollow bedposts, and civilian clothes in sealed spaces beneath floorboards. When searches became too intense, entire sections of tunnel would be temporarily sealed and disguised to prevent their discovery. By the autumn of 1943, Tunnel Tom had progressed far beyond the wire when disaster struck. The Germans discovered it during a routine search. The prisoners were devastated, but Bushell's foresight in planning 3 tunnels proved its worth. They immediately abandoned Tunnel Dick, using it instead as a storage facility for the sand from Harry and for concealing escape equipment. All efforts now concentrated on Harry, the tunnel that would become famous in history. Harry started from Hut 104, beneath a stove in one of the rooms. The entrance was concealed with extraordinary care, and the tunnel stretched forward through the sandy soil, deeper than the Germans' detection equipment could reach. The diggers worked in shifts around the clock when possible, pushing the tunnel forward inch by inch, day by day. The work was exhausting and nerve-wracking. Every man who went down into that tunnel knew that discovery would mean not just the end of the escape attempt, but likely harsh punishment, solitary confinement, or transfer to worse camps. By early 1944, Harry had reached well beyond the wire and was approaching the tree line. The tunnel was over 330 feet long, an extraordinary achievement. Bushell and the escape committee began finalizing their plans for the breakout. They selected 200 men to escape, choosing them based on various criteria. Those who spoke German or other useful languages, those who had the best chance of reaching neutral territory, and those who had contributed most significantly to the digging operation. The list was a source of intense emotion in the camp, as many men who had worked for months on the tunnels would not be among those escaping. The escapers were divided into groups. The first group would be those with the best papers and civilian clothes, who would travel by train to ports or borders. These men would go first, using the cover of darkness to get away from the camp area before dawn. The second group would have good papers but less convincing clothing. The remaining men would be hard-asses, those who planned to travel cross-country on foot, avoiding civilization and living off the land until they could reach a neutral border or find help.
Each man's escape plan was carefully reviewed by the escape committee. Routes were plotted, cover stories were rehearsed, and every detail was scrutinized. Some men planned to head north toward the Baltic coast, where they might stow away on Swedish ships. Others aimed for the Swiss border to the south, a journey of hundreds of miles through the heart of Nazi Germany. A few planned to head east, hoping to reach Soviet lines or find partisan groups in occupied Poland. The date for the escape was set for March 24, 1944. The moon would be dark, providing maximum cover for the escapers as they emerged from the tunnel and made their way to the railway station in Sagen or into the surrounding forests. In the days leading up to the escape, tension in the compound was almost unbearable. The men going through the tunnel had their civilian clothes ready, their papers checked and rechecked, their food parcels prepared. Those not escaping would play crucial supporting roles, helping to organize the movement of men into the escape hut, providing cover during the breakout, and creating diversions if necessary. On the evening of March 24, the men began gathering in Hut 104. The escape was scheduled to begin after lights out, around 10 p.m., with the goal of getting all 200 men through before dawn. The tunnel would need to be traversed efficiently, with men moving through one after another on the trolley system, then crawling the final sections to the exit shaft. But when the first men opened the exit shaft and cautiously pushed aside the wooden trapdoor they had constructed, they discovered a devastating problem. Despite all their measurements and calculations, the tunnel had fallen short. Instead of emerging safely in the forest beyond the tree line, the exit hole was several feet short, opening in clear view of the guard tower. The nearest trees were still yards away. Any man emerging from the tunnel would be potentially visible to the guards. This created an agonizing dilemma. After 18 months of work, countless hours of risk and effort, the tunnel was so close yet not quite far enough. But Bushell made the decision to proceed anyway. They would have to be more careful, but the escape would go forward. They rigged up a rope system where a man concealed near the exit would signal when it was safe for the next escaper to emerge and make a dash for the trees. The escape began, but almost immediately delays accumulated. Men got stuck in the tunnel, their bundled belongings catching on the wooden supports. The rope system for signaling broke and had to be repaired. Some men struggled with claustrophobia in the tight space. Others took longer than expected to crawl through the narrow exit shaft. The bitter cold of the March night made everything more difficult, numbing fingers and slowing movement. As hours passed, it became clear that the hoped-for 200 escapers would never make it through. By midnight, only a few dozen men had successfully crawled through the tunnel and disappeared into the forest or headed toward the railway station. The line of men waiting in Hut 104 grew increasingly anxious as dawn approached. Each man knew that with every passing hour, their chances diminished. If the escape was discovered before they made it through, they would be caught before even leaving the camp. Throughout the long night, men continued to slowly make their way through Harry. They emerged into the freezing darkness, disoriented and stiff from the cramped journey, then had to wait for the signal before dashing across the exposed ground to the relative safety of the trees. Some of the first escapers were already miles away, sitting on trains heading toward ports or borders, their forged documents in hand, playing their assumed roles as foreign workers or traveling businessmen. Then, around 5 o'clock a.m., disaster struck. A German guard on routine patrol happened to stumble near the tunnel exit. Whether he saw movement, heard a noise, or simply got lucky, he investigated and discovered the hole in the ground. The alarm was immediately raised. Sirens wailed throughout the camp as guards rushed to seal off the area. The guard posted at the tunnel exit captured several prisoners who were just emerging or waiting their turn. In Hut 104, the men still waiting to escape quickly dispersed, hiding or destroying any evidence they carried. 76 men had made it out of the tunnel before its discovery.
This was far short of the planned 200, but it was still the largest mass escape from a German POW camp during the war. Those 76 were now scattered across the German countryside and railway system, each following his own plan, racing against time to put distance between themselves and the camp before the massive manhunt began.
The German response was immediate and overwhelming. Every police unit, military garrison, railway station, and checkpoint in the region was alerted. The Gestapo mobilized, as did local police forces and the Hitler Youth. Thousands of soldiers who might otherwise have been fighting at the front were diverted to hunt for the escapers. Roadblocks went up on every major route. Railway stations were flooded with police checking documents. In the forests around the camp, search parties with dogs began systematic sweeps. Despite the massive manhunt, 3 men would eventually reach freedom. 2 Norwegian pilots made it to Sweden by stowing away on a ship from the Baltic coast. A Dutch pilot traveled through France and Spain, eventually reaching Gibraltar and British territory. These 3 successes represented an extraordinary achievement, but the fate of the other 73 would be far darker. Most of the recaptured men were taken by local police or military units within the first few days. They were picked up at railway stations when their documents were checked, found hiding in forests, or caught trying to cross borders. Under normal circumstances, these men would have been returned to POW camps, perhaps after a period in solitary confinement as punishment. This is what had happened with previous escape attempts and what the Geneva Convention required. But Adolf Hitler's reaction to the escape was one of fury. He saw the escape as a personal humiliation and a mockery of German security. The Führer ordered that all the recaptured prisoners be shot. His subordinates, including Hermann Göring, managed to talk him down from executing all 73, but Hitler insisted that at least half be killed as an example. The final order was to execute 50 of the recaptured officers. The Gestapo was given the task of carrying out these murders. The victims were selected, and over the following days and weeks, they were told they were being transported back to Stalag Luft III or to other camps. Instead, they were driven to isolated locations and shot, usually in the back. Their bodies were cremated, and their ashes were returned to the camp in urns with false explanations that they had been shot while trying to escape again. When the urns began arriving at Stalag Luft III, the remaining prisoners were initially told the cover story, but they quickly realized what had really happened. The sheer number of deaths, the circumstances described, the timing, all of it pointed to mass murder. The prisoners were devastated and enraged. These were not combat casualties. These were men who had been murdered in cold blood after recapture, in direct violation of the Geneva Convention. Among the dead were some of the finest officers of the Allied air forces, including Roger Bushell himself, the South African lawyer who had conceived and organized the entire operation was shot along with his French escape partner. They had made it by train to within sight of the French border before being caught. Others were killed at various locations across Germany and occupied territories. Some were shot alone, others in pairs or small groups. The German camp commandant, von Lindenauer, was reportedly appalled by the murders. He had run his camp according to military honor, treating his prisoners as fellow officers, albeit on the opposite side. The executions of the recaptured escapers were a stain on that honor, and he had no involvement in the decision. The murders were entirely the work of the Nazi Party leadership and the Gestapo. Back in Britain, word of the escape and the subsequent murders eventually reached the government and the families of the victims. The British government announced that those responsible would be held accountable after the war. This was not an empty threat. When the war ended in May 1945, the Royal Air Force established a special investigation unit whose sole purpose was to track down everyone involved in the murders. These investigators spent years hunting across occupied Germany and Austria, finding witnesses, gathering evidence, and locating the perpetrators.
Many of the Gestapo agents who had carried out the killings were themselves killed in the last days of the war or committed suicide. Others tried to disappear into the chaos of post-war Germany, but the investigators were persistent and methodical. They found the men who had given the orders, driven the vehicles, and pulled the triggers. These men were put on trial for war crimes. The trials resulted in numerous convictions. Some of the perpetrators were executed. Others received long prison sentences. The hunt for those responsible continued well into the 1950s, with several men being tracked down in various countries and brought to justice. The investigations became one of the most thorough war crimes prosecutions of the post-war period. The story of the Great Escape became legendary among Allied airmen and the general public. It represented everything that the POW stood for: ingenuity, determination, courage, and refusal to give up the fight even in captivity. The men who dug those tunnels under the most difficult conditions, who created forged documents in civilian clothing from nothing, who planned and executed such an ambitious operation, embodied a spirit of resistance that inspired their fellow prisoners and people back home. And the 50 men who were murdered became martyrs. Their deaths, a stark reminder of the nature of the Nazi regime and the importance of the fight against it. The surviving prisoners at Stalag Luft III continued to resist in whatever ways they could until they were liberated by Allied forces in 1945, never forgetting their comrades who had given everything for a chance at freedom.